Sitting at breakfast on a sunny morning, I was enjoying the peace and quiet. A cup of strong coffee sat on the table, and I was slowly chewing my omelet when I heard a car pull up to the house. Looking out the window, I saw the mailman leave something in the mailbox and drive away. I leisurely finished my breakfast, then got up and wandered outside. Opening the mailbox, I found an envelope. It was a letter from my grandfather, George Hartley. Grandpa never quite got the hang of modern technology and preferred writing the old-fashioned way. I should really visit him, I thought, opening the envelope. Inside was a note. "Hello, Michael, it's been a while since I wrote to you. How are you doing? I hope everything is well. I'm doing great. I've decided to raise rabbits, such cute creatures. Anyway, what I wanted to tell you is that my friend Frank, who lives next door, brought me an old parchment recently. We couldn't decipher it, and I remembered that you're studying to be an archaeologist. So I decided to send this map to you. I hope you can make sense of it. Well, I hope you're doing well. It would be great if you could visit me. Love, your grandpa." Reading the letter, I felt a slight pang of guilt. I must visit him, I thought. Besides the note, there was an old parchment in the envelope. It looked as if it had survived more than 100 years. The parchment depicted a landscape, but it was impossible to determine where it was located. Ancient writings in an unknown language complemented the picture, and in the corner there was a wolf's head, like a crest. What is this? I thought, intrigued by my grandfather's discovery. Returning home, I sat at the table and began studying the parchment. Searching the internet and archives, I found nothing similar. Deciding to skip classes, I continued my search. After 8 hours, I stumbled upon a forum where someone showed similar writings and claimed that an ancient civilization, older than the Mayans and Aztecs, possibly existing tens of thousands of years ago but suddenly disappeared, once resided in the United States. Only rare writings, numbering in the few, remained from them. Due to this, mainstream science dismisses it as nonsense, but the author was convinced it was true. Reading this, I just smirked. Conspiracy theorists have come up with something again, I thought. But looking at the parchment once more, I decided to study it in more detail at the university tomorrow. I woke up early in the morning feeling a slight excitement. After a quick breakfast, I headed to school. The road took half an hour, but soon I was at the parking lot, across from the massive brick building. Merging with the flow of students, I confidently headed to the laboratory where my friend Derek worked. We met during my practical work and quickly became friends. Opening the door, I found myself in a sterile room. White walls, shiny tiled floors, and rows of high-tech equipment created an atmosphere of scientific research. The air was filled with a faint smell of chemicals and cleaning agents. Derek was sitting in the corner, engrossed in studying a sample. I called out to him, and he, noticing me, smiled. "Hey, Michael," he said, putting aside his work and walking up to me. "Hey, Derek, listen. I have something interesting," I said, pulling the parchment I got from my grandfather out of my bag. Derek took it and, after carefully examining it, said, "It's well preserved. You want to know its age?" I nodded. "Yes, there's a lot of fraud these days. And I want to know if it's really ancient. If it is, it's a sensation." Derek nodded thoughtfully. We decided to conduct a radiocarbon analysis to determine the age of the parchment. Using a sterile scalpel, I carefully cut a small fragment of the parchment, trying to minimize the damage. We placed the sample in a special container, protected from external contamination. Then we performed preliminary processing, cleaning it from contaminants, and placed it in a small furnace to remove all modern traces of carbon. After cleaning the sample, we placed it in a spectrometer to measure the content of the carbon-14 isotope. The spectrometer measured the amount of C14 and compared it to the amount of stable carbon isotopes. Knowing the decay rate of C14, we could calculate the age of the parchment. Derek entered the data into the computer, and after a few minutes, a number appeared on the screen. We froze, staring at the figures. "This parchment is about 10,000 years old," my friend said. I couldn't believe my eyes. "Is this real? But how could it survive for so long? If you hold it in your hands, it feels like it's still fresh. From experience, I know that not everything can last that long. Is this some kind of magic?" Thoughts swirled in my head as I looked at the analysis results. Seeing my surprise, Derek said, "The results are in front of us. We conducted the analysis correctly." We discussed the discovery, sharing our hypotheses and assumptions. Perhaps the parchment had some unique properties, or its owners knew ancient methods of preserving materials. I decided to show it to my academic advisor, Professor Carlyle. The classes were about to end, and I had time to meet with him. I headed to his office, feeling the excitement grow with each step. This discovery could change everything we knew about ancient civilizations. Opening the professor's office door, I saw him at his desk, engrossed in reading yet another scientific paper. "Professor Carlyle, I have something you need to see," I said, holding the ancient parchment in my hands. The professor looked up and, seeing me, smiled. "What do you have there, Michael?" I placed the parchment on the table before him. He looked at it, then raised his eyes, his gaze full of disbelief and amazement. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice slightly trembling. I told him about my grandfather sending me the parchment and how Derek and I conducted the analysis. The professor listened attentively, his hands slightly trembling, revealing his excitement. When I finished, he sighed heavily. "Actually, I've been studying this topic for a long time, and this discovery is incredible," he said, standing up and opening the top shelf of a cabinet. He pulled out a folder filled with ancient documents and newspaper clippings. Opening it, he began taking out the papers one by one. "Here, look," he said, showing me a photo. "This is a small iron plate with similar writings. It was found in Evergreen, Washington. When digging a foundation pit, workers discovered it in the ground. Unfortunately, all the letters were almost erased." He took out another photo. It showed fragments of shards adorned with a symbol of flames surrounded by sun rays. This fragment was found in Arkansas. It also had a couple of symbols left. I conducted research, and none of the modern linguistic scripts are even close to this. This is something entirely different, and such finds are very few. Many consider this a hoax because there is so little evidence. But I believe there is a lost millennium that modern civilization knows nothing about. And this parchment, it's a miracle it has survived. All these symbols, if we find more, we could understand them and uncover history. The professor was visibly excited and inspired. It was clear that this subject had been troubling him for a long time. He began pacing around the office, continuing his story. "We have a group of like-minded people who share my point of view. They will be so thrilled," he said, calming down and sitting at the desk to study the parchment. "Can you leave it with me?" he asked, looking at me hopefully. I nodded and took a photo of the map so I could study it myself. After that, I left the professor alone with his discoveries. When I went to the university the next day, I discovered that Professor Carlyle was not there. Anxiety began to fill me like the dark waters of an approaching storm. I hurried to the dean's office and found out that the professor had suddenly taken a leave of absence, and no one knew where he was. I tried calling him, but he didn't answer. What happened to him? This thought tormented me for a long time. A week passed, filled with worry and speculation. I tried to match the map's data with real coordinates, but 10,000 years had passed. Soil erosion and climate changes could have drastically altered the landscape. The map schematically indicated mountains, a river, a lake, and a forest. In the middle of the mountains, there was a skull drawn, the meaning of which remained a mystery. The place where something was hidden was marked by a wolf's head, the same as the crest in the corner of the parchment. One evening, sitting at home and pondering the map, I suddenly heard the phone ring. I picked up the phone, and on the other end, I heard Professor Carlyle's voice. He sounded tired but excited. "Hello, Michael. Sorry for disappearing, but my colleagues and I have made some progress. If you don't mind, come to the address I'll send you." I was surprised by the call, but agreed to come immediately. The trip took 40 minutes, and soon I found myself in front of an old building, once wealthy, but now losing its luster. Approaching the rusty gate, I tugged at the bell, which made a dull ring. Soon the front door opened, and a stout guy walked towards me. He was wearing a t-shirt over a denim vest, long shorts and sandals. Seeing me, he smiled and waved, indicating that he would open the gate soon. Walking quickly to the gate, he opened it and extended his hand. "Hi, my name is Chip. You must be Michael, right? Come on in, the professor said you'd be coming." He led me inside the old house. The atmosphere was one of neglect and ancient mysteries. Dust covered the furniture, cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling, and the creaking floorboards underfoot created the feeling that the house had a life of its own. We walked down a long corridor, the walls of which were adorned with old paintings and faded photographs. The light from the windows barely penetrated the thick curtains, creating a gloomy ambience. Chip opened a massive wooden door, and I entered a spacious room lit by lamps and candles. We entered a large room filled with several computers, their screens glowing with green and blue graphs and tables. The walls were covered with various papers. In the center of the room was a large table cluttered with instruments and various maps. Around the table were 4 people, one of whom was Professor Carlyle. When I entered, the professor stood up and greeted me. "Michael, good to see you," he said, extending his hand. "You must have already met Chip." He nodded towards the stout guy who had opened the door for me. "And this is Layla." He pointed to a woman about 30 years old, dressed in a blue blouse and black pants. She had long curly hair and glasses that accentuated her beautiful blue eyes. "She specializes in geodesy." Then the professor pointed to a tall man with a mustache dressed in a white shirt and pants, who appeared to be around 45. "And this is Bradley. He's a geophysicist, an expert in underground research. His knowledge was invaluable for analyzing subterranean structures." Chip, as I already knew, was a computer specialist. He was sitting at one of the monitors, quickly typing something on the keyboard. After everyone introduced themselves, the professor began to explain what they had been doing all this time. We studied the map. Despite the schematic nature of the drawings, they accurately indicated the location of objects relative to each other, which gave us some clues. Then the hardest part began, finding landmarks. We started exploring all the mountainous areas in the United States and Canada that border rivers. When the search area narrowed, we began studying the history of the rivers since 10,000 years had passed. This could have been a dead end, but Layla and Bradley took on the task. They went through archives and compared the data, then uploaded it into the computer, and Chip was able to structure and determine the approximate location. We also started searching online and other sources for places with landscapes resembling a skull. We found 3 such places, and combining all the data, we understood where to go. I stood with my mouth open, listening to their report. These guys had really done a great job. Looking at them, I realized they were all specialists in their fields. How did the professor gather them? Later, I found out that they were also interested in the lost millennium and were as much fans of this theory as the professor. After the professor finished his story, Chip invited everyone to eat. The Chinese food had just arrived, and I didn't refuse. At the table, we discussed various theories. Chip, with his mouth full, told me how he once stumbled upon a photo of a find belonging to that era on the internet, and he was drawn to the idea of the unknown. I asked them how they knew it was a civilization. They shook their heads, saying that an unknown person had put forward this theory, but they didn't know who he was. Then I asked where the place indicated on the map was. The professor looked at me and replied, "It's in the Siskiyou Mountains area, near the Rogue River." Hearing this, I was surprised and said, "That's where my grandfather lives." The room fell silent. Everyone exchanged glances, and the professor slapped his forehead, letting out a short laugh. "Typical," he said, shaking his head. "An ordinary person would start searching from where the map was found and would contact the person who found it first. But we began with the most complex path. That's the problem with scientists." Suddenly, he laughed, and everyone laughed in response. The expedition was ready, and they planned to leave tomorrow, and of course they invited me to join them. I couldn't refuse such an adventure. Soon, I said goodbye to everyone and headed home. When I reached my bed, I collapsed onto it, exhausted but excited. In the darkness of my room, I pondered what lay ahead. I recalled my grandfather's map and the mysterious symbols. This place, these coordinates, it all seemed unreal, fantastic. Closing my eyes, I imagined forests and mountains hiding ancient secrets, and how we would embark on a quest for the answer tomorrow. Images of skulls and wolf heads, ancient civilizations and lost millennia flashed before my eyes. Tomorrow could be the beginning of something great and dangerous. With this thought, I fell asleep, not knowing what awaited us, but knowing that it would be something that would change everything. In the morning, I woke up early, filled with a mix of excitement and anticipation. I quickly got ready and headed to the meeting place. When I arrived, I saw a pickup truck parked by the roadside. Everyone was already there, loading equipment into the bed. The professor noticed me and waved. "Good morning, Michael. Ready for an adventure?" I nodded, smiling. We loaded the last boxes with equipment, maps, and provisions. I took the front seat to guide the way. We decided to stop by my grandfather's place first to learn about the map's origins. We quickly left the city and hit the highway. We drove along winding roads, navigating through dense forests and rugged terrain. As we delved deeper into the wilderness, the paved roads turned to gravel and then to dirt trails. The sun slowly rose above the horizon, casting golden rays on the road. After a few hours, we reached our destination. The place where my grandpa lived was on the edge of a forest, in a small village. As we drove up, I saw little wooden houses scattered throughout the area. The village was peaceful and serene. People lived simply here, surrounded by nature, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. Wide paths, trodden down over the years, connected the houses. Each home had a small garden where vegetables and flowers grew, giving the place a cozy and self-sufficient feel. My grandpa's house stood at the very end of the village, next to the dense forest. It was an old but well-kept house with a porch and a garden. On the porch were a couple of rocking chairs and a small table with a vase of wildflowers. The wooden shutters on the windows were painted a bright blue, giving the house a picturesque look. I knocked on the door, and soon my grandpa appeared on the threshold. Tall and sturdy for his age, with gray hair and clear blue eyes, he looked surprised at my unexpected arrival, but his face quickly lit up with a warm smile. "Michael, what a surprise!" he exclaimed, opening the door wider. I introduced him to my companions, and then we went inside. When he learned that my professor was with me, he became even more bustling and led us to the living room. "Please have a seat. Let's have some tea first, and then I'll call Frank. He'll tell you where he found this parchment." We settled in, and Grandpa made some tea. It was evident that he was glad to have such guests. While we sat at the large wooden table, Grandpa quickly went outside to call his friend. While waiting, I looked out the window leading to the backyard and saw cages with rabbits, Grandpa's new hobby. I was happy that he wasn't bored and had found something to do. After a while he returned, leading an old man. It was Frank, Grandpa's old friend. He looked tired, but curiosity shone in his eyes. He was surprised to see so many people in the house. "Well, Frank, tell them," said Grandpa, nodding towards me and my companions. The old man sat down, sighed, and began his story. "Recently, I went to the doctor, and he prescribed morning walks. I've always taken my health seriously, so I decided to follow his advice. At first, I walked around the village and along the edge of the forest, but I quickly got bored. So I decided to walk in the forest, although locals know it's quite dangerous. Why, you ask? Because this forest is unusual, and strange things happen there sometimes. Unusual creatures live there, but I've never encountered anything myself, even though I've lived here for decades." He paused, looking at us to make sure we understood. So, I went into the forest and started walking. I didn't notice anything unusual. My daily walks took me further and further in. One day, I stumbled upon something interesting. It was an old wooden house with a forge next to it. I looked around. It was abandoned, with various old things inside, nothing particularly interesting. But among all the junk, I noticed a small chest under the bed. Opening it, I found this map. I decided to take it with me. Then I showed it to George. That's the whole story. We asked Frank if he could point out where the house was. He shook his head. When I decided to go back the next day, I found nothing. That's when I realized this forest is indeed unusual, he said, smiling sadly. Well, I thought. My grandpa had never told me about this place. I wondered why. After having tea, we thanked Grandpa and his friend, then went outside and began unloading equipment from the car. Grandpa, seeing this, asked where we were going. I explained our plan to him. "Be careful," he said, clearly concerned. It's indeed a dangerous place. We geared up, taking everything necessary for the expedition, and got some general directions from Frank. Then we entered the forest. At first it seemed ordinary. Tall trees, thick underbrush, and the sound of birds. But the further we went, the more we felt something was off. The air became heavy, pressing down on our shoulders, and the silence that followed us was almost deafening. Suddenly, We heard rustling and noises coming from deeper in the forest. It could be a bear, I thought, and we hid in the nearest bushes. Our hearts were pounding like hammers. Soon we heard footsteps coming closer. Besides the crunch of branches, there was a strange sound, like something being dragged. A silhouette appeared in front of us. Dark and indistinct in the twilight under the trees' shadows, it looked like a person, but was somehow distorted. I peered closer and gasped in fear. Instead of a human head, this creature had a bird's head. I couldn't tell if it was a pheasant or a quail. It was dressed in a long cloak, completely covering its body. On its head was a straw hat, and in its mouth a straw. The creature was dragging something tied with a rope and wrapped in a cloth. As it passed by us, I noticed a paw sticking out of the cloth. It was an animal, but I couldn't tell what kind. The creature moved slowly, looking around. We held our breath, hiding in the bushes. When it almost passed us, it suddenly stopped and looked directly at the bushes where we were hiding. I thought it had spotted us, but the creature just glanced our way and continued on. We exchanged frightened glances. What was that creature? Was it a person in a costume? Whispered Chip, pale as a sheet. Or something else, added Bradley, trying to find an explanation. Professor Carlyle, a man of science, seemed more stunned than anyone. This is impossible, he whispered. The line between reality and fantasy seems to have disappeared. We started discussing what we had seen in whispers. Layla, still trembling, quietly said, "That creature, it looks so real. Maybe it's a spirit or something supernatural. Maybe it's an ancient being that survived through the ages," Bradley said thoughtfully. "We know so little about what hides in the forests." The professor, still in shock, just shook his head. "We've stepped into the unknown. What we saw doesn't fit into the framework of our knowledge." Had we just entered the forest and immediately encountered such a thing? Was it our luck or misfortune? We continued on our way, this time using GPS, deciding not to search for the house but to head straight to the place indicated on the forum. We walked for another half hour when we heard rustling again. After the first encounter, we were extremely cautious, so we heard the noise from a distance. There were no bushes here, so each of us chose a tree to hide behind. At first we heard some clicking sounds. Soon strange creatures appeared on the path. They were the size of 5-year-old children, their heads resembling bulbs and their bodies looked like dolls. Instead of skin, they had bark, and their faces were 3 holes, 2 eyes and a mouth with no nose. In their hands they carried something glowing like lanterns. They hopped along and hummed something to themselves. I tried to hide as best I could. Though they didn't seem dangerous, who knew? Suddenly one of them stopped and looked at the tree Chip was hiding behind. The creature couldn't understand what was sticking out from behind the crown and wanted to approach closer. I then took a stone and threw it ahead. These creatures immediately got agitated and looked angrily in that direction. Their empty eyes lit up, and the lanterns went out. It seemed as if the light had seeped into them. In the meantime, Chip managed to move to another spot, and when the creature returned, it found no one. They moved on. We breathed a sigh of relief, once again amazed by this place. We continued on our way, remaining as cautious as possible, when suddenly, in front of us appeared a house. We didn't seek it out, it found us. The house looked old but surprisingly well maintained for an abandoned place. Its walls were made of sturdy wooden beams, darkened by time but not rotten. The roof was covered in moss and patches of grass, giving it an almost fairy tale appearance. The windows were small with wooden shutters that were currently closed. Tall trees grew around the house, their canopies creating a semi-darkness which added a sinister atmosphere to the place. We walked around the cabin and went inside. It turned out that it wasn't abandoned as it seemed from the outside. Inside, there was a cozy, albeit somewhat gloomy atmosphere. We first entered the kitchen. Wooden shelves along the walls held various herbs and jars with unknown contents. The table was cluttered with various items, from stones to kitchen utensils. It smelled of fresh herbs and something sweet. From the kitchen, we moved to the living room. Here, a fireplace was burning, its soft light and warmth filling the room, but there was no one in sight. The chairs and sofa were upholstered in dark, slightly faded fabric. The floor was covered with antique rugs. Suddenly I heard the sound of a beating heart. Looking around in fear, I realized the sound was coming from a small chest on the table. I slowly approached it and carefully opened it. Inside I found a pendant. It was strikingly beautiful, an oval medallion of polished silver with inlays of sparkling red and yellow stones that shimmered in the firelight like stars in the night sky. We exchanged glances, and the professor told me to take it. "It might come in handy," he whispered. After that, we searched the house again but found nothing else. Leaving the mysterious cabin behind, we continued our journey, cautiously making our way through the dense forest. Fortunately, strange creatures no longer crossed our path, and we began to hope that those encounters were just coincidences. The forest became denser, and soon we heard the faint sound of water ahead. As we approached, we came to a river. Its waters were dark and calm, flowing slowly as if hiding their secrets. The banks were overgrown, with stones and driftwood protruding from the water, creating strange shapes. We decided to follow the river, hoping it would lead us to the right place. The water babbled, its sound soothing, but there was still a sense of unease mixed with excitement in the air. Soon the landscape began to change, becoming increasingly rocky. The river still flowed beside us, but the banks grew steeper and the stones larger and sharper. About an hour later, we noticed a mist starting to settle over the water. We entered a canyon shrouded in fog. High walls rose on either side, narrowing the space, and the mist blanketed the ground, creating an eerie atmosphere. Light barely penetrated through it, and each step felt like a step into the unknown. We continued, trying not to lose sight of each other. Chip, pulling out his tablet, read aloud the forum description. "The skull-shaped rock lies in the heart of the canyon. Go straight and you won't miss it. It's both beautiful and eerie. I don't know if it's a natural phenomenon or man-made. One can only guess." We continued on, and finally, the skull-shaped rock appeared before us. It towered over the canyon like a silent guardian, keeping its secrets. Looking incredibly ancient, the rock seemed to stare at us with empty eye sockets. The nasal cavity was a deep crevice that plunged into the rock, creating an impression of endless darkness. The mouth, twisted in a grotesque grin, was a large opening covered in moss and lichen, like the lips of a monster. The rock's surface bore traces of erosion, but the overall skull contour remained disturbingly clear. Deep cracks and chips could be seen in places, adding realism and horror to the image. The upper part of the skull was covered in thick moss and sparse shrubs, giving the impression that the skull was growing out of the ground. We began to examine the area, wondering what to do next. We walked around it, trying to find any traces or clues. Bradley, as always, was in his element, setting up his geophysical equipment. He set up the ground-penetrating radar and began scanning the surface. We watched as he moved slowly around the rock, closely studying the device's screen. Suddenly he stopped. His face lit up with excitement. "It seems I found something interesting," he said. "There's a cavity underground. It might be a cave." We came closer and Bradley pointed to one of the skull's eye sockets. "The entrance should be here." We peered into the dark void. Bradley, armed with a flashlight, began examining the eye socket. There, hidden behind the stone, he discovered a narrow tunnel. "There's a passage here," he said, "but it's very tight." With difficulty but determination, we began to crawl inside. It was especially tough for Chip, his bulkier frame making the narrow passage a real challenge. Eventually, one by one we squeezed through the narrow passage and found ourselves in a cave. The cave was dark and cold, its walls covered in damp moss and glistening mold. The floor was uneven, strewn with rocks and stalactites hanging from the ceiling like stone claws. The silence was deafening, broken only by our footsteps and quiet breaths echoing into the depths of the darkness. We moved through the tunnel, illuminating it with our flashlights, carefully stepping over the uneven ground. The walls around us were damp and cold, and the air grew increasingly dense and heavy. Suddenly a vast space opened before us. We emerged into a large cavern, its grandeur and mystery overwhelming. Before us stood huge stone stelae inscribed with the same language we had seen on the map and artifacts. Alongside the inscriptions were various drawings depicting scenes seemingly from ancient history. We stopped, mesmerized by the sight. We immediately began examining the stelae, taking photos of each symbol and image. Each of us was filled with awe and wonder. These stone slabs could tell us the story of a civilization we knew nothing about until now. "Look at this!" the professor called us over. We gathered around one of the stelae, which depicted an epic battle. There were humans, next to whom was engraved the flame symbol with rays and many others, fighting various creatures, from trolls to other monsters. But the main figures were a huge wolf alongside a knight and a creature with tentacles and many eyes. We studied the depiction in amazement. "Is this someone's fantasy?" Chip muttered. "Or did such a battle really take place?" The drawings looked so realistic and detailed that it was hard to believe it was mere fiction. The information on the stela was partially erased, adding to the mystery. We continued studying the stela and discovered a drawing depicting an explosion. It was dome-shaped, similar to a nuclear explosion, but different from the ones we knew. After this drawing, the images ceased. "Could there have been some explosion at the end of the battle that destroyed the civilization?" Bradley whispered, his voice trembling with excitement and fear. We looked around, trying to understand what had happened in this place thousands of years ago. The cave was full of secrets and mysteries. We knew that what we had found could change our understanding of history. "Incredible," Layla said. "These drawings, they seem to be warning us about something." "We must investigate everything here," the professor said, his voice full of determination. This could be the key to solving the mystery of the lost civilization. Suddenly, I heard rustling, or rather a scurrying sound. I turned around in fear, recalling our recent encounters with various creatures and knowing that this place could be dangerous. "Something's approaching," I whispered to the others. We froze, trying not to make a sound. "Be ready," he said, his voice tense. Suddenly, we saw something crawling toward us. It felt like it had been asleep and was now awakened. These creatures covered in dirt crawled slowly, stretching their limbs until they finally stood upright. In front of us stood terrifying humanoid frogs. They were repulsive and sinister, their eyes glowing with hunger. "We need to run!" I shouted, and we bolted further into the cave. The creatures gave chase. We sprinted forward, illuminating our path with flashlights, stumbling over rocks and uneven floors. The sounds of our running echoed through the cave, mixing with the guttural growls and slapping of webbed feet behind us. These creatures pursued us relentlessly, their filthy bodies sliding across the ground with a sickening squelch. At the end of the cave, we came upon a massive stone door. It was adorned with carved symbols and images, as if guarding something ancient and sacred. We struggled to open it, pushing and straining, and finally burst inside. It was a huge tomb. In the center stood a stone coffin, surrounded by candles that seemed to have been burning for centuries. We closed the door behind us, and the creatures outside began pounding on it, but couldn't get in. The tomb was filled with a dark beauty. Along the walls stood stone statues of creatures similar to those that had chased us. Only these looked more like bats. Their massive wings were spread wide as if they were about to take flight, and their faces were twisted into grotesque expressions of horror and rage. We stood, breathing heavily, realizing that while we had escaped imminent death, we were now trapped in this ancient tomb. The walls, covered in faded frescoes and symbols, told the story of a long-forgotten civilization. And in the center of it all stood the stone coffin, majestic and terrifying at the same time. "We're safe. But what now?" Chip whispered, looking around. We began to explore. It was an amazing place, but the coffin in the center of the room interested us the most. Despite his fear and exhaustion, Professor Carlyle stepped forward resolutely. "We need to find out what's hidden here," he said, and we began to carefully open it. The lid of the coffin creaked heavily as we pushed it open. Inside lay a knight in black armor. His armor was as black as if it absorbed light, adorned with strange symbols. But the most terrifying thing was that instead of a human head, he had the head of a wolf. It looked as if he had died recently. The fur was still soft, and his eyes seemed to be watching us, though they were closed. The coffin was lined with soft fabric, as if even in death this being was given honor and respect. The knight held a huge sword, its blade gleaming even in the dim candlelight. "Look at this," Bradley whispered, but his words were interrupted by Layla's scream. "The statues are starting to move!" she screamed. We turned and saw that the stone statues, resembling bats, began to slowly come to life. Their stone wings scraped, and their eyes glowed with a malevolent light. They slowly rose to their feet, emitting a low growl as if awakening from a long sleep. At that moment, I felt the medallion in my pocket come to life. The sound of a beating heart echoed through the tomb. Meanwhile, the monsters were awakening and growling, filling the space with threatening sounds. I pulled out the medallion and suddenly it glowed and flew out of my hands, heading toward the coffin. I didn't see what happened to it next as the creatures started closing in on us. There was no way out, and enemies were outside as well. It seemed like the end for us. But as one of the monsters leapt at me, I caught a glimpse of movement. Something flew out of the coffin and split the creature in half with a massive sword. It was the wolf knight from the coffin. He stood before us, holding his sword, which now glowed with a mysterious light. His movements were swift and graceful, like those of a true warrior. With a roar of fury, he charged at the awakening monsters. The knight fought with incredible strength and precision. His sword cut through the enemies, leaving behind arcs of light. He moved so quickly that our eyes could barely follow him. Each of his movements was deadly and graceful. He cleaved one creature in half, then decapitated another, and impaled a third. The monsters tried to surround him, but he was relentless. His strikes shattered them into pieces, blood and flesh scattering throughout the tomb. He emitted deep growls, mixing with the screams of the dying creatures. Soon the entire tomb was covered in the remains of the monsters. When the last enemy fell, the Wolf Knight stopped and turned to us. His eyes glowed with a sinister light, but there was a strange wisdom and strength in them. Suddenly, as if sensing something, he rushed to the door. The frog creatures were waiting there, but he easily cut them down and rushed on. "This is our chance!" the professor shouted, and we ran after him. We raced through the tunnel, following our mysterious savior. Soon we found ourselves back in the section of the cave with the stelae. But to our horror, it was filled with monsters. They swarmed the entire cave as if appearing out of nowhere. But the Wolf Knight didn't stop and charged into the thick of the battle. With each step, his sword described shining arcs, cutting down the monsters with incredible force and precision. His movements were fast and deadly, like a whirlwind of steel and claws. He pierced, slashed, and crushed the enemies, each strike echoing through the cave, interspersed with the screams of the dying creatures. He cleaved one monster in half, then decapitated another, giving them no time to react. The frog-like creatures tried to surround him, but their efforts were futile. The Wolf Knight moved with such speed that it seemed as if he was everywhere at once. His sword gleamed in the torchlight, leaving a trail of blood in its wake. One of the creatures, a massive bear-troll hybrid, attempted to attack from behind, but the knight sensed its approach. He turned and with a single stroke pierced the beast, causing it to collapse to the ground with a muffled roar. Several more creatures lunged at him, but he parried their attacks, striking down his foes with relentless precision. Every movement of the Wolf Knight was lethal. His sword danced, leaving a bloody path. The creatures tried to resist, but they stood no chance against such force and speed. He carved his way through the ranks of monsters, obliterating them with his ferocious onslaught. We stood in awe and terror, watching this epic battle. It seemed as if the knight was an ancient deity, come to punish evil. With each blow, he destroyed more and more enemies until none were left alive. The Wolf Knight ran again, as if driven by some unknown force, and we followed. Soon, a light appeared ahead, piercing through the fog and stone walls of the cave. The knight didn't crawl through the narrow passage but magically blasted a hole in the wall, then shot outside. We hurried after him and found ourselves in the open air. In the middle of the canyon stood a strange creature, unlike anything I had ever seen. It resembled a gigantic praying mantis, crossed with a centipede. Its body was covered in chitinous plates that glistened in the sunlight. Huge, curved claws gleamed menacingly, and long, segmented legs moved with terrifying speed. The creature's head was covered in fangs and spikes, and its large eyes glowed with malice and hunger. Its tail, resembling a stinger, writhed like a snake ready to strike. The creature roared upon seeing the Wolf Knight, and they clashed. Wasting no time, the knight charged at the enemy, raising his glowing sword. The creature let out a horrific screech and lunged forward, its claws snapping like sharp scissors. The Wolf Knight dodged the first blow, and turning swiftly struck back with his sword. The blade, shining with magical light, met the chitinous plates of the monster with a ringing sound. The creature recoiled, spewing a stream of poisonous saliva that sizzled as it hit the ground. The Wolf Knight continued his assault, his movements swift and precise. He slashed and stabbed, seeking a weak point in the monster's defense. The creature defended fiercely, its claws and stinger striking wildly, but the knight moved with such speed that he remained invulnerable. Suddenly, the creature tried to attack the wolf knight from the side, but he anticipated the move. As the monster lunged forward, the knight dodged and struck at a side segment. His sword pierced the soft flesh between the chitinous plates, and the creature roared in pain. The monster attempted to strike the knight with its stinger, but he was faster. The wolf knight grabbed the stinger with one hand and with the other struck with his sword, slicing it in half. The creature screamed, struggling to free itself, but the knight was relentless. He swung his sword and delivered a final crushing blow. The massive head of the creature rolled to the ground and its body trembled and fell with a heavy thud. The wolf knight stood over the defeated foe, breathing heavily, his sword stained with the monster's blood. He lifted his head and looked at us, his eyes still glowing ominously. We stood in shock, unable to believe our eyes. Suddenly he approached us and said something in an unknown language. His voice was deep and resonant, like an ancient echo from the depths of time. Professor Carlyle tried to respond, but the knight only shook his head and pointed toward the forest. It was a clear sign. He was telling us to leave. Who was he? We decided not to take any risks and headed for the exit. The wolf knight vanished into the mist, dissolving into the air like a ghost from a distant past. We retraced our steps, trying to collect ourselves. We were silent, contemplating everything that had happened. Despite all the horror and incredible events, we didn't leave empty-handed. We had photos of the stelae and many theories about a great battle in the past that changed the world. We realized that this battle might have wiped out an ancient civilization and altered the course of history. But how exactly it happened, we still had to understand. We emerged from the forest and returned to the car, feeling like people who had returned from another world. Later, we tried several times to find that place again, but we couldn't. It was as if an unknown force was keeping us out. The forest seemed to hide its secrets from prying eyes, guarding its ancient mysteries. We returned to our ordinary lives, but each of us knew that what we saw and experienced had changed us forever. We continued working on uncovering the secrets of the stelae, hoping to someday understand what exactly happened in that ancient forest and what role the wolf knight and other creatures played in it.